Good evening. It's a pleasure to have you, some of you again, and some of you just now, in our series of five lectures on the collections and research which is taking place at the music department and everywhere else based on the music department treasures. And one of these founders or digger of our treasures that comes back and forth and says, wow, you know what I heard, what I found, is Naomi Cohn-Zentner, which I think I met when she just started her BA or MA. And now she's already for several years a PhD, Dr. Naomi Cohn-Zentner, who is teaching in several places, but she recently established a Jewish music program at the Schechter Institute, which I think it's the only program which really deals with all aspects of Jewish music in a real serious and pluralistic way. So it's an answer to somebody who asked what are people doing now in research. So Nomi could answer this question, what subjects are coming up in her classes for further research. And she also has recorded many things, many traditions, many people, and deposited all her recordings in our collection. And without saying more, I would let Nomi actually speak on her wonderful topic. I'll try to say it the right way. Resounding ritual, time and place, Psalm 136, Shir Malot, in the German Jewish tradition. So thank you, Nomi, for your lecture. I'm sure it will be great.
Thank you very much, Gila, and I want to thank you for being so welcoming to the music department of the National Library, to always being so generous with your time and sharing the wonderful treasures that we know exist and can be found in the National Library's music department, recordings and manuscripts. And as you say, whenever I discovered anything, I would come very excitedly to your office and into the space where only librarians were allowed, the sacred Kodesh HaKodashim, and very excitedly share what I found in the amazing treasures of the National Sound Archives of the National Library. And today's research is just one of many things I have found by delving and searching into the catalog, and many of the manuscripts and of the notations and recordings, which I'm going to show to you today, originate from there, and were things which were found in the catalog, and even things which I eventually was able to contribute of my own to the catalog, which is always an even greater honor to be someone who builds another choma b'chomot Yerushalayim, meaning to add on another level of small, everyone contributes a small addition to knowledge of whatever there is existing already. So I thank you very much, Gila, and thank you to the National Library for inviting me to be part of this reading room, delving into the musical treasures of the National Library. So I thought that first we should start with a recording of a documentation. This is from one of the first sessions I ever recorded in the National as part of my research into the domestic traditions of the German Jews. There's Mirot Shabbat, that was the topic of my PhD dissertation. And part of what I was doing was interviewing usually the older generation of immigrants who came to Israel. And in this case, I was interviewing Chana Pick Goslar. Chana Pick was born in Berlin in the 1920s, and I interviewed her at her home in Jerusalem in 2006. And she told me of the custom that was customary in her parents' house to sing Psalm 126, Shir Ma'alot, to different tunes according to the different festivals which were happening around that time of year. So we're going to hear the recording, and I translated it here into English for you to hear.
אבל לכל החגים היה. ושל שבועות אני לא זוכרת. את זוכרת אותה? את יודעת את זה? את שאלת איזה יקים? לא. אבל סוכות קראו לזה השטלניגן. את לא מכירה את זה? כן, זהו. לא מכירה. כן, זה תמיד... זה מהלל, הם שברו את זה. כן, כן. זה היה תמיד מאוד טוב, ישבנו בסוכה והשכנים למעלה בדרך כלל אכלו באותו זמן, אז הם התחילו ואנחנו המשכנו איתם. אבל זה היה בסוכות, ובשבועות לא היה סוכה. בפסח זה... רגע. לה 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 פסח, אז אמרתי, ושבועות את יודעת במקרה? אני כל שנה, אני מתרגזת שאני שכחתי. אני יכולה לומר לך. כן, יש עוד, כמה יקים יש עוד שיודעים את זה.
So what we hear, besides Hannah's wonderful personality and very Yekish, the German Jewish characteristic, there are a few Yekim around who still remember, but we hear Hannah's frustration in a way. She remembers certain of the tunes. She remembers the tune for Passover, and she remembers the tune for Sukkot, which was easy to recall because there were people on the Sukkah, in the open space of the Sukkah in Jerusalem. There were other German Jewish immigrants who could start the tune and then you could hear it and then you would recall the melody. But she does say it was difficult to recall the Shavuot tune. And so when we hear her speaking, we hear three different times in the culture of German Jews. The first time we hear are the three festivals of Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot. The second is she's recalling Berlin, pre-Holocaust Berlin, where she's recalling the tunes which her parents used to sing and memories of her home, which was destroyed during the Holocaust much later on. And the third point in time that she's recalling is Jerusalem after the Holocaust. And there she and her husband, who is also born in Germany, tried to recall the melodies of their hometown, sometimes with more success than others. So between 2006 and 2014, I performed field research, recordings and interviews to try and document the domestic traditions of the German Jews. And I heard them expressing very similar emotions to that of Hannah. On one hand, we know that one of music's qualities is the ability to open a window in time, to bring us back to a certain time where these melodies were sung and recalled, and to sanctify sanctify time and to bring us into a different time. At the same time, it was kind of a pained, almost recalling a traumatic time, because this was so clear, the contrast between the current day Jerusalem life and the home that she had grown up in, and the melodies which were part of a larger system of a tradition of a community which had a long-standing tradition, and for many, many years, between that, the very rich past and the fragments which today could be recalled by certain families who were survivors of the Holocaust and who could keep a sliver of memory and tradition and melody. But let's go back to the very beginning. Maybe we should start by asking, when does Psalm 126, Shir HaMa'alot B'Shuv Hashem, start to become part of the grace after meals? And what is this special system of musical signifiers where a tune can symbolize a ritual and liturgical time? A tune for Passover, another tune for Sukkot, and another tune for Shavuot, and having kind of a musical calendar of different melodies signifying different sacred times. So the addition of Psalm 126 before the grace after meals on Sabbaths and on festivals is actually a relatively modern custom. It's recalled in halachic sources only from the late 19th century, such as the Mishnah Brura, but manuscripts from Central Europe show that this custom was actually already popular in the mid-18th century. So here we have a manuscript, if you can see, from Poland from 1728. And here we begin Shir HaMa'alot with kind of a zimun, Nodeh L'Shimcha B'toch Emunai, and then we start Nevarech Shachalnu Mishelo and the first blessing. So there's no Shir HaMa'alot for many, many years. They simply start the grace after meals. So that is from Poland from 1728. This is a seder for Brit Milah and Birkat Hamazon, and this actually is a special zimun for Brit Milah, blessing the person who is performing the circumcision, blessing the circumcised and his family and parents and community, etc. But here we have a manuscript from Mannheim, 1743, and we see that by the mid-18th century in the Upper Rhine region, we already have you see here in red, Shir HaMa'alot B'Shuv Hashem, something which should be sung B'Yom Shabbat V'Yom Tov V'Yomim She'en Omrim Be'em Tchina Yomar Zeh. So this already appears as a prelude to the grace after meals, something to be said on Sabbath and festival. And we don't really know why. Again, as a musicologist, it's clear to me that I could presume there's a musical reason for this. This is a time where more and more music is being added to the Sabbath tables. Milot Shabbat are very popular. And so it only makes sense that if you're sitting at a table, eating and drinking and singing, that you would add another reason for a tune as a prelude to the grace after meals, which is generally, maybe there are some short sections which are sung to a melody, but generally spoken. But in halachic sources, the source of this saying of Shir HaMa'alot, and here we have another manuscript from Frankfurt. This is from 1824. It's already illuminated, and you have some nice sketching and drawing. But in halachic manuscripts, the reason that this is said, the reason given for actually saying this, is because every person who is a God-fearing Jew must decry and be sad for the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. And how do we do this? So Mishnah Brura on the Shulchan Aruch says that the destruction of the temple, the Shla says that every meal we must say Al Naharot Bavel on every weekday meal, which is again the Psalm of mourning, of leaving Israel, and how should we sing the Song of Zion on the land of Babylon. And on Shabbat, and on special days where we don't say Tachanun, such as festive days, Yomar Shir HaMa'alot B'Shuv Hashem. And so this is like the halachic reason for saying Shir HaMa'alot, because this is a way to remember and recall the destruction of the temple and the great galut, the diaspora, the beginning of the 2000 year of diaspora, etc. So Shir HaMa'alot is given as one of the reasons and the ways in which we sort of recall this very important commandment of every Jew to remember the destruction of the temple, especially during mealtime every day. So this is part of the issue and the question of why do we say Shir HaMa'alot. And now we move on to the melodic system. So we're talking about a ritual where there are certain seasonal melodies, and these melodies are able to create a system implementing the musical sanctification of time. So we know that it's not only the Jews that sanctify time. I mean, this is while it's at the very core of Jewish religious thought and ritual, the idea of the mechanism which link seasonal melodies to certain times around the calendar is something which is a universal one. It's kind of a universal mechanism of connecting certain melodies or certain makam, certain raga, certain modes to a certain specific time of year. And so we know that this has to do with religious music's capacity to highlight and evoke a time of day, a time of year, a time of month. And this is one of its most dominant capabilities, religious music. That's something which religious music knows how to do. And although the mechanism forming a system of seasonal melodies is a culturally constructed one, it's linked to the community's aesthetics, sensibilities, and tradition. So in each tradition, you have a different culturally sensitive system which is created, where a certain melody comes to signify within this homogeneous community a certain time of year, and it can be used to allude to a certain time of year, even if it's mentioned not at its correct time. And we will speak about how sometimes certain tunes were sung not in their natural time as a way to convey and give kind of a hint. So to see the system in action, let us turn to the Shavuot melody. This is a tune which Hannah was trying desperately to remember, this tune which she tried to recall at the interview, which we heard at the very beginning. And this same melody is used to reference musical anticipation. And this is the notion of Professor Eliyahu Schleifer, who speaks of distant musical anticipation in a way where sometimes this can be done a few weeks in advance, and sometimes it can be done very, very closely as a way to give some kind of anticipation towards the music which is going to come. So the tune which is used during the Sabbath or the Chag meal, the festive meal for Shir HaMa'alot, is actually based on a liturgical poem, an Aramaic piyut Akdamut Milin, which is recited during the Torah reading of that day of Shavuot. And this is a piyut reshut, which means a piyut to ask for permission. The translator is requesting the congregation's permission to start the Aramaic translation of the Torah cycle. And this melody was used for Akdamut Milin in German-speaking communities since the mid-18th century. It was also sung to other texts which were used during the prayers of Shavuot of that day, such as the verses for Hallel. So today we're going to see this tune, and we're also going to see the way it was sung for Shir HaMa'alot, and the way the same tune was sung for Hodu. I mean, on the same day of Shavuot, we hear this tune in several different places within the prayers, besides, of course, the tune for Akdamut Milin itself. And then everyone would come home from synagogue, and they would sit around the festive table. And after they finished the meal, before Birkat HaMazon, before the grace after meals, they would sing Shir HaMa'alot to the same tune that they had sung that day in synagogue a few times. So let's hear a recording of Benno Weiss. He is originally from Frankfurt, but he lived in New York, and this recording is from New York. And we will hear him sing Shir HaMa'alot.
Shir HaMa'alot v'shuvat Hashem Eshivas Tzion Hodinu k'chalmin Osimu le'tzachafinu U'le'shanenu rinu Yamavu v'agavim ikil narashem Asasimele ikil narashem Asasimono Oyinu semechim Shuvu adashem eshebiseinu kapikim Ba'aniger Asavim bedimo Verino yiksavu Olach yelech Umochal Now say Mishach Asora Ayoma Verino
We will stop here, but you can see there's the notation of this melody to different words appears in Zelig Scheuermann's collection of tunes which were sung in Frankfurt, published in 1912. And he uses this to the words set to the words of Hodu. So we understand that the same tune was used in certain musical anchors within the prayer of that day, both for Akdamut, for the tunes of Hallel, like Hodu and Anna, etc. And later on, when everyone came home from synagogue, they would sing it for Shir HaMa'alot around the Sabbath table, around the festive meal, not necessarily Sabbath, but it could be Sabbath before or after, or that day's festive meal. Now, can we understand why this melody was more difficult to record than the melody for Sukkot? First of all, it's a complicated tune. You can hear it's a little bit of a complicated melody. And also, if you imagine, this is something which would really be heard in abroad. It would be heard for 2 days, and it would be heard in the synagogue. So it's much easier to recall a tune that you just heard a few hours earlier in synagogue, and then you sing it, you echo the tune of the synagogue at home, as compared to Chana, who's sitting there. And in Israeli synagogues, this is no longer a living tradition in liturgical festive prayers for Shavuot. Therefore, it would have been much more difficult to recall a tune that she heard maybe a year ago, once a year, to hear this tune of Shavuot. I sometimes try and call her before Shavuot to see if we could sing it together, because it's helpful to have someone in a sukkah sing it the floor above yours, because then they can remind you of a tune of Sukkot. But Shavuot, as she says, in Shavuot, there's no sukkah. In Shavuot, there's no one there to remind you, no compatriots who come from the same German Jewish tradition who are able to remind you of this tune. So the same way that there's this tune for Shir HaMa'alot on Shavuot, there are tunes for the entire musical calendar, for the entire Jewish calendar. This is the tradition of Frankfurt, because we have actually quite a lot of documentation from Frankfurt, collections by Oguch and others, and Geiger, who mentioned certain traditions of melodies, and of course Scheuermann, who's one of the later ones, and even earlier we have from Yafet. And so we have quite a good musical documentation of the traditional melodies which were used in synagogues in Frankfurt. And so today I'm speaking more or less about the Frankfurt tradition. And so here we have a very nice, but I'll tell you soon why this is a problematic table, giving us the names of all of the tunes which are used for Shir HaMa'alot. So in general, Shir HaMa'alot melodies are echoing tunes sung in the synagogue for piyutim special to that day. For example, on Rosh Hashanah, the tune for Shir HaMa'alot is the tune which was sung for a piyut called Hayom Harat Olam from the Musaf service for Rosh Hashanah. And the second day could be a different tune for the piyut Eder Vahod. So the tune from the piyut for that day is used for the Shir HaMa'alot melody at home. In Sukkot, we'll soon speak about the Lulav Shutl Nigen, the melody for shaking the lulav, which is sung during the Hallel, when we shake the lulav. This is a special tune, and this tune is what was used at home for Shir HaMa'alot. Shmini Atzeret, we'll talk about that soon. Simchat Torah, known as the Yaris Kaddish. This was a compilation of all of the festive piyut melodies. So we see here like an entire musical calendar. And so only very few talented people were able to perform, to move from Pesach to Shavuot to Sukkot and end up with the tune of Agil ve'Esmach, a piyut for Simchat Torah, which was the traditional tune for Shir HaMa'alot. And this Yaris Kaddish was often also used for Shir HaMa'alot of that day. And this has to do with the kind of the jovial, funny atmosphere that Simchat Torah used to have. I think today maybe less. Today this is more allocated to Purim, perhaps. But once upon a time, Simchat Torah was really a day of making tricks, of tying. The children used to tie the talit to the chair and all sorts of silly tricks. And so this was kind of a funny day, a festive day. And the tunes for Shir HaMa'alot were done in this special, complicated manner of using the compilation of all of the festive piyut melodies one after the other. On Chanukah, of course, we have the tune of Maoz Tzur, that is the leitmotif, that is the seasonal melody for Chanukah, also sung for Shir HaMa'alot. On Pesach, there are differing traditions. They used to sing both Adirhu from the Haggadah, Shir HaMa'alot Beshuv Hashem, Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kecholmim, or the Tfilat Tal, because on that day there is a special festive tune in the synagogue, Tal Ten Lirtzot, and it has a special tune, and so this tune was also used as the tune for Shir HaMa'alot. In Sfirat HaOmer, one of the Geulim piyutim from the morning service for Pesach was used for Sfirat HaOmer. On Shavuot, as we mentioned, the Akdamut Milin was recited, which was recited before the reading of the Torah, was used as a melody for Shir HaMa'alot. And on Shabbat Chazon, just before Tisha B'Av, we have the tune of Eli Tzion, which also becomes kind of the seasonal leitmotif of this whole time of the 3 weeks and the 9 days, a period of mourning. And this became the tune for Shir HaMa'alot. So we're speaking of Shir HaMa'alot Beshuv Hashem, Et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kecholmim, אז אימא לשחוק בינו, ולשוננו רינה. And so you knew what day it was according to the tune which was sung on Shir HaMa'alot. And usually it was a tune which was echoing a liturgical tradition which had happened in the synagogue but a few hours earlier. And so what these special piyutim in the synagogue in the German Jewish tradition gave a certain flavor, a certain festive atmosphere to the prayers around it. And it was used in different segments of the day of the Sabbath and festive prayers, not just for the piyut. And also it was echoed in the home as a way in which the home tradition echoed these liturgical piyutim, connecting in a way, linking kind of an umbilical cord between the home and the synagogue. So it's a way to elevate the family meal to being much more festive and maybe even sacred, and giving an added value to just beyond the mere eating of food, something which gave it kind of a sacredness and connected it to the sacred traditions of the liturgy. So this is a very nice table, but I have to tell you, it's very problematic. I'm telling you as someone who compiled this. It's very problematic for a few reasons. One is that the tunes, for example, for Rosh Hashanah or for Yom Kippur, were very much based on local traditions. So if you had a synagogue in Hamburg, in Denmark, in Amsterdam, and again, we're speaking of the German-speaking Jews, so it's a larger region than just what we call Germany. So each one of these in Switzerland and in Hamburg and in Copenhagen, each one of these had a different tradition for the liturgy, different tunes which were used for Eder Vahod, for Hayom Harat Olam, for Asher Imatecha. And so since it wasn't a set liturgical tradition, the domestic sphere, which was echoing the liturgical tradition, also had a different flavor. And so, for example, for Rosh Hashanah in Frankfurt, they would sing the melody of Hayom Harat Olam. But actually, in other places, for example, in Basel, they used to use a tune for the Kaddish of that day, for the tune for Shir HaMa'alot. And so what we have here is something which is very not precise. It's perhaps particular for Frankfurt, but it's not something which can be generalized to all the German-speaking Jews because of these regional liturgical traditions which were later echoed in the home. That's one problem we have with this. The second one is that, as you see here, I'm calling this the name of the piyut, something which is echoing a liturgical tradition. But here we have a few melodies in which these are domestic traditions which are actually used in the synagogue. For example, Maoz Tzur. Maoz Tzur, which is sung during the lighting of the candles at home. Of course, this later became also a tradition of lighting in the synagogue, but generally this is something which was done in the home, is used in the synagogue in certain places for Hallel, maybe for the Chadodi, for Mi Kamocha, and becomes a liturgical leitmotif of the season of this time of Hanukkah, which is later used for Shir HaMa'alot. Same thing for Adirhu. Adirhu is a piyut which is sung as part of Lela Seder, on the Seder night, a piyut which appears in the Haggadah. And so again, this is a domestic custom. It's not necessarily a liturgical custom which is echoed in the home, but rather it's a domestic custom which was also used in the liturgy of that day. So there are a few problems here. These two problems I have with this very nice table mean that it's not accurate completely, and it has to do with a very specific regional custom, and it's not necessarily the home echoing the synagogue. Sometimes it's the other way around. So since we saw Shavuot as one example, let's move on to a few of the other chagim which we can see here. For example, let's talk about Passover. Adirhu, a piyut which we know is used in Lela Seder. We don't know who wrote it, but it's probably from the 14th century. Let's hear a Kaddish. Remember, we said that also certain segments of the prayer could be done in this seasonal leitmotif. So the Adirhu tune lends itself to the Kaddish for Pesach.
תברך ירוסי וימליך מלכוסי וחייכון וכשיומך ישראל בגולות.
So he starts off with the Adiru and then he moves on to a few different other of the piyutim for different times of the year. So maybe this is something that has to do with a certain Yaris Kaddish kind of tradition. What we see here in Shoyalman's score is for Hodu. Hodu Adonai ki tov, ki leolam chasdo, etc. So we have this tune of Adirhu, Adirhu, Ivne Beto Bekarov. Of course, there are very different versions for this tune too, depending on which family and how it's sung and where they come from, etc. So Hodu and Kaddish, which was sung in the synagogue, is sung to the tune of Adiru. And of course, Shira Ma'alot Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion Hayinu Kecholmim Azim Nales Chok Pinu Ushonenu Rihina Az Yomu V'Goyi V'Lanai Lasoti Melech Na 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 da 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 da. So the same tune is used as part of a real system where there's a signifier and a signified. The tunes are signifying a certain time of year. And it's a very close-knit system, which is based, of course, on having a homogeneous community, in which you can repeat the cyclic system every year and retain this sort of signifying importance which they have. And so the Song of Ascents, the Shira Ma'alot, is kind of this connector between the home and the synagogue. And we will ask ourselves soon what happens when this connection is severed, such as which had happened in the 19th and 20th century with many waves of immigration and migrants, large waves of immigration moving from east to west, to America, to England, etc. And of course, culminating in the greatest tragedy of the Holocaust, in which the communities, the synagogues, the places which housed these liturgical traditions, the people who were part of the ecology retaining this musical custom were destroyed, and so these communities really no longer had anything to sustain this system. They were tragically perished in the Holocaust, and only traces of what was once a very large systematic mechanism of connecting time and place with music, connecting time with ritual, with music. All this is kind of gone and disappeared. But we will speak about where these things still had a continuity, and we'll speak of this soon. So we spoke of Adirhu as a tune for Passover. There's also a tune for Sukkot. The tune for Sukkot, although we keep speaking of piyutim, of paraliturgical poems, as the source of these tunes, the tune for Sukkot actually has no words. It is the tune called the Lulav Shitl melody, the Lulav Shitl nigun. And this is a tune which, as we can see in the illustration, the Lulav was shaken at this time. And there's a very specific way of doing it. And we will hear the Shira Ma'alot again, but the tune which was used was a way to do the 4 directions of the shaking of the lulav within the melody, within the words of Hodu l'Adonai ki tov ki leolam chasto. Na 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 Hodu l'Adonai ki tov. Oh no, I got it wrong. Hodu l'Adonai ki tov. So here we hear this Shira Ma'alot sung by Benna Weiss.
Shir Hamalos V'Shov Hashem Eshiv Asiyon Oyinu Kachamim Asimu Le'Sachavtinu U'Shaonenu V'Ino Asyamu V'Gavim Igdil Arashem L'Sausim Ele Igdil Arashem L'Saus Imonu Oyinu Shemechim Aral Shemesh V'Yiseinu Kafigim B'Negev Asavim B'Dimo V'Vino Yiktavu Olach Yelech U'Mocha Na'aseh Misha Asura Vayova Berino Na'aseh Alu Mauso Yilas Aral Shem Yidaber Pi Yiborech Kol Moso Shem Kodshao L'Olam Boret ואנחנו נבורכו מהטוב יד עולם הללו הוא.
We'll end here, but it's really very special to hear these melodies. I see some people smiling. Maybe it's familiar to them. For certain people who come from this musical tradition, this is the flavor of the time. This is the flavor of Sukkot. It's almost like the soup that you would eat once a year. It have a special taste. And so this is a special tune which is very specific to Sukkot. And we hear Hannah recalling it in the beginning, which we heard in the interview. And this musical code in question, which we're speaking of now, is part of a larger semiotic system where dress and food and certain synagogue ornaments, such as the parochet of a certain color, all these had an important part in creating a special sense which was specific to a certain festival. So for example, Mordechai Breuer, who grew up in Frankfurt, recalls the impression he had upon seeing the special blue and white silk talit worn by the Chazan only on festivals compared to the black and white striped talit, which was used on the weekdays and on Sabbaths. And local culinary customs, which are described in articles from the 1920s, of course, all of this material is from the National Library. They're the ritual customs of the Jews of Hessen, which is the district where Frankfurt is close to it. Let me just find the words. So he describes how certain tunes, certain food should be eaten on certain occasions. So he describes how, after describing the appropriate menu for a circumcision, which is coffee, in case you're wondering, and for a wedding, sour cabbage. So this article proceeds to describe what dishes should be used on a special Shabbat. So on Shabbat Chanukah, the first canned green beans should be enjoyed. Okay, this is apparently a real delicatessen in 1926 to have a can of beans, which should be saved and savored only for Shabbat Chanukah. And on Shabbat B'Shalach, wheat should be added to the soup, since the wheat will split in the soup like the splitting of the Red Sea. So this is an article on the culinary customs of the special Shabbatot, how every food has to be relegated to a special symbolic or some kind of other taste of the special festive Shabbatot. So we see that the musical system of liturgical signifiers, which was extended into the domestic sphere in Shir HaMa'alot, is also part of a larger system in which dress and food and the parochet and the way the synagogue is dressed all help to create a certain flavor for every one of the festivals. And so I want to tell you what happens after this musical system is unfortunately doesn't have the liturgical ecology to sustain it. When the synagogues are destroyed, when there are no longer communities who keep the liturgical traditions, and we know that after the Shoah, many of the German Jewish liturgical traditions were largely lost, because while there were many Eastern European Jews who could come together, there were very few German Nusach, traditional German liturgical synagogues, which preserved the customs of this time. In the synagogue, the melodies and the way of even the pronunciation, the Yekkish pronunciation has also kind of been lost. There are certain places in France, in Switzerland, one synagogue in New York, where Benno Weiss is probably from, Washington Heights, synagogue in London, the Monks synagogue, and in Tel Aviv, Yichud Shevet Zion, in Oel Nechama in Jerusalem, and Chaurev, which was known to be preserving Yekish traditions. But I think that today these are largely lost. And even at that time, not everyone could come and belong to the synagogue, which was preserving these German liturgical music and tradition and choir and the chazan and the way of pronunciation and the special tamei mikra, the special cantillation melodies which were used. So these are kind of, in a way, sadly, generally lost. So what happens when people sing a song, but they don't have the connection to the liturgical event that it's meant to be memorizing? Of course, we know that every tune in home is echoing a liturgical tune, but what happens when you no longer have a liturgy which is referring to? So I'll tell you the story. I recorded in 2013 Professor Josef Bodenheimer, and he is born in England to two parents from Frankfurt. So he sings a tune for Shira Ma'alot. He sings it for Shmini Atzeret. This is a special tune for Shmini Atzeret. And after he sings this tune, this is of course a great challenge for me. So I run and look for all of the piyutim for Shmini Atzeret, which maybe could be a source for this tune, which I've never heard before. But I can't find any. I don't find any piyut for Shmini Atzeret, but I do find a tune for Pesach, which is the same tune. So let's hear the way Yosef Bodenheimer sings Shira Ma'alot for Shmini Atzeret, and then we'll see where it's coming from.
שיר המעלות בשוב אדוני, את שיבת ציון היינו כחולמים, אז ימלא שפות פינו, ולשוננו רינה, אז יאמרו בגויים, הגדיל אדוני לעשות עם אלה, הגדיל אדוני לעשות עמנו, היינו שמחים, שובה אדוני את שביתנו, כך הקים בנגב, הזורים בדמעה, ורינה יקצרו.
So it's very interesting because what we see is actually that this tune was a tune which was sung in synagogue, not on Shmini Atzeret, which we would expect, but actually on Passover. And it's sung as a piyut for requesting tal, right? This is a time for asking for dew and stopping to ask for rain. And then we hear this as a Shira Ma'alot tune for Passover, for Pesach. Benno Weiss again sings the same tune for Pesach.
Shira Ma'alot b'shuv Hashem, Shivas Tzion hoyinu gechalamim, os yimule tzachak bino, ולשוננו וינו, os יאמרו הגויים, הגדיל השם לעשות אלה, הגדיל השם לעשות עמנו, היינו שמחים, שובו עד השמש בישרנו, אפיקים בנגב, הזזים בנימו, ברינו יקצרו, ולך ילכו בוחר, נעשה משך הזרוע, ביובח לרנו, נעשה אלומה סוף.
This is a lovely tune. It's almost operatic. We hear how it's just so expansive. Of course, Benno Weiss sings it about 3 times slower than Josef Bodenheimer, but I hope you're able to discern that it's actually the same tune, right? I don't know if you're able to, sometimes tempo puts us off a little bit, but it's the same melody. And you can even see the notation where it's actually used for Tal 10. And we hear a recording also from the National Sound Archives of Mordechai Broel singing the way this tune would be sung in Pesach for Tal 10. And it's amazing because this recording was done in 2003. And this notation is from 1912, and they're so close. In almost 190 years, not very much has changed, despite the fact that so much time has gone by. So we'll hear how this tune is sung in synagogue.
Eloheinu Velohei Avoseinu Tal Tein Lirtzaus Artzecho Shiseinu Berocho B'ditzecho Rav Dogon Mesirash Behavritzecho Kalmeim Yirbo Chevtzecho V'tol Tal Tzavei Shonot Tavo Umuteret Pri Oretz Lagoan Ulesif Eretz Yir Kesuko Noseres Simo V'yodecho
Okay, I'm stopping here, but I think it's interesting to note that when Bodenheim is singing this to me as a tune for Shmini Atzeret, he has no knowledge that this is any festive piyut tune or any other festive text connects this melody to the day. And the liturgical collections in Frankfurt reveal that this song was actually sung in Pesach, in the liturgy, as a tune for the piyut Tal Ten Lirtzot. And the tune which is said during the morning prayers, the Shacharit prayers for the first day of Pesach, was naturally echoed at home for the Song of the Saints, for Shir Ma'alot, by some families. So this was the Shir Ma'alot tune for Pesach, not the Adirhu tune which we sang before. This was sung for the first days of Pesach. And it was also sung during Shmini Atzeret, because what is common to both Shmini Atzeret and Pesach, the first day of Pesach, is of course the motive of a prayer for water. When you sing with one melody, of course, indicating the beginning of the rainy season, and the other indicating its closing. And so this motive of water, which was common to both festivals, is highlighted using the same tune for Shmini Atzeret and for Pesach. And eventually the domestic practice changed, and it became customary to sing Shir Ma'alot to the melody of Adilhu for all of Pesach, and not just for the Pesach's last day, as is customary earlier. So this left Tal Ten Lirtzot solely for Shmini Atzeret, with no clear connection to a liturgical poem of that or any other day. Now, for Bodenheimer's parents and grandparents, both these festivals were bound together with this melody, which was part of their liturgical soundscape. But for Bodenheimer, who was born in England after his parents had fled Germany, the melody was detached from any seasonal or liturgical context. And so we understand that when this system no longer has a liturgical base to base on, they just become tunes, and nobody knows that they actually originated in a piyut, which used to be part of the tradition of a musical community, of a traditional Jewish community in Germany, and very much part of the sound of the day. And so this is something which we have lost in a way. But on the other hand, sometimes, I'm going to skip this. We can see these tunes as kind of a way to sanctify time. I thought maybe I would ask one of you participants to maybe volunteer to read out a little bit of Heschel, Abraham Yoshua Heschel, who speaks about the Shabbat and the idea of sanctifying time. How do we sanctify time? I wonder, Doron, if we're able to ask someone to raise their hand and to to volunteer to read. A brave person. Maybe my mother. Mother? Yes. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Judaism is a religion of time aiming at at the sanctification of time. Judaism teaches us to attach holiness in time, to be attached to sacred events, to learn how to consecrate sanctuaries that emerge from the magnificent stream of a year. The Sabbaths are our great cathedrals. Jewish ritual may be characterized as the art of significant forms in time, as architecture of time.
Thank you, Ima. So we hear that Judaism is actually quite believing not in creating cathedrals, not very good at building very big buildings which remain and have a sense of awe, but we do, our Judaism teaches us how to attach holiness to time, how to sanctify time. And I think music is very good at doing that. And so what we're speaking about today is really a system of musical signification in which music is helping us to sanctify time, to create a cathedral in time, to create a sanctuary, which are part of, as he says, the magnificent stream of a year. So the Sabbaths are great cathedrals. And Jewish ritual is characterized as the art of significant forms in time. And so this whole system, which we're speaking about, is really a system of creating and forming a certain taste and sense, feel, and music and sound, which is specific to a time. And what happens when we lose our ability to connect this to a place or to a synagogue, which used to take place in this place? So we see here some pictures of Frankfurt, the actual place, the Judengasse, the Jewish quarter or ghetto or the Jewish street. And we ask ourselves, can sound be constructed not only as memory of time, of a sacred time, but also help us to construct a memory of place? On which place? This is also connected to the way the synagogue, which used to sound this specific melody on Shavuot, on Shmini Atzeret, on Pesach, and when we have an absence of time, what is good is that in the absence of these synagogues, the home has to take place as something which is memorializing. So what is lost in this process, meaning we understand that since we no longer have these synagogues to resound these certain sounds of time, so resounding the liturgical melodies of German Jews after 1945 echoes the absence of the synagogues in which they were sung, and the family and the community of which this music was part. So when Hannah is singing the song, she also has in her mind the absence of the people and the places in which these songs were sounded. And so when singing the Shir HaMa'alot in the home, while it's not an act of reenactment of commemorization, these melodies have in effect become a memorialization of places and people which are lost. So this is significant because the practice of singing Shir HaMa'alot before the Birkat HaMazon was established in the context of exile and memorialization of displacement as a means of fulfilling the obligation to remember the destruction of temple and to remember the loss of place. And now singing these tunes in the home are in a way, kind of a way to have a signifying, to be a memory not only of a time, but also of a place, which is no longer existing. So what is lost after the synagogue, after the Holocaust in Israel and elsewhere, the liturgical melodies which had originally only been heard in the sanctified spheres of the synagogue, they now become to memorialize those sacred spaces by being sung in the domestic sphere. And so creating a moment of represence. We are bringing the presence of a place back. But what is lost in this process is the melody's direct signification of liturgical time through what was once an inextricable connection to the traditions of the synagogue. And so we ask, what does this melody come to signify for the post-war generation to which it lacks its liturgical context? Can a melody evoke the memory of a family member or a community or a place, even when the memory of it being sung is not a personal memory, but rather an indirect family one? So when the family sings these tunes and young children who were born after the Holocaust and their children, they're all part of a system in which the family continues to sing these songs. Is it a way of also memorializing the place which it was sung and the families which used to sing it, even though it's not the direct memory of those who are singing these tunes. So I know that our time is coming to an end. I just want to conclude by saying that in a way, the family and the home was able to be more resilient to these terrible processes of displacement and Holocaust and destruction, better than the synagogues. And we see here the synagogue in Frankfurt as compared to the home. And in a way, the domestic sphere is a site of preservation for liturgical traditions because it keeps the tunes which were sung in the synagogue alive by singing them in Shir Ma'alot every time that the festival comes around. And so the tune which was sung in the synagogue for Akdamut Milin is no longer sung in any synagogues for Akdamut Milin, or maybe one or two, but it's sung in many, many homes of German Jewish families, which continue to preserve these liturgical traditions in the home as a living tradition. And this is something which is very interesting. It's kind of a counterpoint of time and place, which occurs when this musical practice is performed in Israel and elsewhere. And these are sort of echoes of a musical sonority of Frankfurt and echoes of this, they're sort of kept alive in the domestic spaces. The text that it's set to, Shir Ma'alot, Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, is actually recalling the redemption of earlier, calling for and longing for the redemption of the much earlier Babylonian diaspora. And so it's interesting because the text of Shir Ma'alot is actually speaking about how we need to long for the redemption and long to return to Israel and Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, perhaps a dream of what would happen when the day comes, while the music which is sung by the German Jews are recalling the diaspora, especially when they're in Israel, the sound of the diaspora as a place of longing and of memory and of love and family. And so we have an interesting parallel, an interesting way of how all these things are coming together. And I think that I would like to just conclude with what happens when you sing Shir Ma'alot in Israel. So in Israel, there's no second day of Galuyot. And so you have less chance to sing certain tunes, for example, for Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret, because they're both brought into one day. And if certain tunes would be relegated to the second day of Passover or the second day of Shavuot or of Sukkot, now we are missing a day. We're missing a chance to sing these tunes. So an interview again from the National Sound Archive of a Jew who's born in Hamburg, Moshe Hildesheimer. He says, in Israel, there's no Shmini Atzeret, which means he's missing a tune. He's missing a chance to sing a tune. So I sing this melody to Shir Ma'alot on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Sukkot, because if you don't sing it, it gets lost. So we need more opportunities to sing because all of these second days are gone in Israel. And so we don't have another chance to sing these tunes, which are very significant, especially for people who are Holocaust survivors. And we spoke about the significance these tunes have to them. Another interesting thing which happens when singing Shir Ma'alot in Israel is this the use of the mechanism of having a whole system of signifiers, of melodies who signify ritual time, are using new tunes which are more relevant to the Israeli reality, such as Adona Selichot, which is a piyut sung by Babylonian Jews and by the Sfarad Yerushalmi traditions on Elul. So you can use this tune because it's everywhere. It's on the radio, it's in school, and all the children know it. This is a real seasonal tune. This is a tune which you hear at a certain time of year. And so this would be a tune which is sung for Shir Ma'alot, even though it's a Sephardi tune, and the custom is an Ashkenazi tune. So creating kind of a hybrid Ashkenazi-Sephardi ritual where the system, the mechanism is Ashkenazi, but the tune is Sephardi. So that's what happens in Israel. Of course, we know this is typical of what happens in Israel. Another example is Hatikva, which could be sung as the tune for Shir Ma'alot during the month of Iyar. So these are things which happen in Israel. And another thing is an interesting thing, which of course brings us back very nicely to the notion of the National Library as a collector of memories, is that people document themselves. Autoethnography in the National Library is full, and especially the music collection is full of recordings, cassettes. People would recall all the tunes of Shir Ma'alot on a cassette, so the next generation has, so they don't forget. They would publish scores in memory of a wedding anniversary, where every tune, Shir Ma'alot LePesach, Shir Ma'alot LePurim, and this is kind of a way to continue something, because they see this decline in a living tradition, and there's a fear this is going to get lost. So many people would record themselves, and this is part of the collections which we have and which we've heard here. Benno Weiss records himself, Henry Zimmel records himself. They're all recording traditions which they're afraid are going to get lost. And lately we have websites, such as one called Shir HaMa'alot B'Mangina HaNechona. Okay, notice the value judgment. In every Chag, there's a serious problem. I'm translating here. What is the tune? We sit for hours around the table and we try and remember. And it's very clear, there are a few hints. If you move your hands around, you'll remember the nigun for Nanuim, the Sukkot nigun, which only works on Sukkot. Rosh Hashanah, you can remember the tune for the Piyut, Hayamarat Olam, and then you remember what the tune is for Shir HaMa'alot. And of course, tongue in cheek, they say certain poskim even allow you to turn on the computer, beshinoi, of course, to remember the tune, because it's permitted to turn on the computer to remember the correct tune for Shir HaMa'alot. Okay, this is of course a joke. Don't take me too seriously. But this is a very Yekish sense of humor, and those of you who know it, you'll know what we're talking about. So here you have the ability to actually press and hear the nigun for Shloshta Shavuot, the nigun for Tishat Yamim, and here's a hint, it's Eli Tzion, the tune for Sfirat HaOmer, and this is like the cycle, the way of people to remind themselves. And again, it's hard to remember because it's no longer a living tradition in the synagogue, to remind themselves of the tune, of how important it is to remember the tune of the psalm, which was really part of an exile, but in 20th century Israel, is this tune, we were trying to remember Zion, or are we trying to remember Germany with this tune? So it's really, I think, an interesting question. So I think that I've taken up all my time, and we spoke today about how resounding ritual time and place, Psalm 126 in the German Jewish tradition, using many, many sources, resources, documentation, books and recordings and scores, which are all part of the music collection of the National Library of Israel. And I thank you very much for your patience and for your listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohn-Zentner. Somebody has a speaker open. There's an echo. I have a few questions. Aside from Shir HaMa'alot, can you please elaborate on the power dynamic between synagogue traditions and domestic ones?
That's an interesting question. You would assume that the synagogue, you have a professional. You have a professional, this is the cantor or the musical director of the choir, and he is the one who determines what will be sung in the synagogue. Whereas the home is more a place of autonomy where every family can choose what they want to sing. But it's interesting, this choice to connect yourself to a collective and to sing the tunes which you know everyone else will be singing for Shir HaMa'alot, and being a very important part of the self-identity is part of a collective identity. So on one hand, synagogue music is portrayed to be something which is sort of very sanctified and ritual, and somewhere where there's a professional who decides. And the home ritual is a place where you have more and more ability for tunes which are not Jewish tunes to enter, because it's more of a secular sphere. In the home, it's perhaps a place which is more flexible and open to the soundscape of what's going on around in the non-Jewish surrounding. And so things can come into the home which won't necessarily come into the synagogue. But of course, often tunes become popular in the home, and then afterwards they're known as kind of sacred tunes, and then they can go on to be used in the synagogue because they've been kashered. They've been converted to Jewish tunes, and then you can use a nice tune for Menucha V'Simcha, or a tune which was used for Shir HaMa'alot in the synagogue as kind of a sacred Jewish tune. So it's interesting to see the power of dynamics between what goes on in synagogue and what goes on at home. And often there are tunes which are used in both the domestic sphere and the liturgical sphere. So that's a little bit about, I mean, there are other texts which are used from the home. There are other texts which are used from the home in the synagogue. Le'ela shel Shavat Mikol HaMa'asim is a Hasidic tune which is used, it's sung at home, but it's using text from the Shacharit, the morning prayer for Sabbath. And so even quotation of text and of melodies, it's kind of a go-between. There's a cross-fertilization between the liturgical sphere and the domestic sphere. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Are there other melodies originating in synagogues which are sung at home, aside from what you mentioned?
Yes, there's a large number of synagogue tunes, although usually it's the other way around. Usually it's tunes which are sung at home, and they become very well-known tunes. And then when you need to say a very long piyut on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, you need a tune which everyone's going to recognize and join in with. And so you can allude and begin a tune which everyone already is familiar from the Sabbath table, and then everyone's going to join in. So it's generally the direction is from the home to the synagogue, but it's not always the case.
Thank you very much. There are many compliments in the chat. I will absolutely send you the transcript so you can read them yourself. Last question is, are synagogue melodies considered more sacred than domestic ones?
Well, that's a big question. We know that in the 17th century, we have a shut, a question responsa, in a book of Yosef Ometz by Rabbi Yosef Han. And this is a way, and he says, please do not sing the tunes of Kol Mekadesh Shvi'i, etc. in the non-Jewish tunes. It's really unacceptable. And then afterwards you bring it into the synagogue. And so in a way, this is something where it was perhaps permissible to bring non-Jewish tunes into the domestic sphere. But at some stage when it comes into the synagogue, this is not really allowed. And I think what's interesting about Shir Ma'alot is kind of this echoing. The home is echoing what's going on in the synagogue, and it's giving kind of a bigger soundscape to the tunes, so that they're not only relegated to the special piyut of the day, but they become part of the larger sound of the time, not only in synagogue, but also in the home. So it becomes sort of a sound, a leitmotif of the season.
I will open microphones for people to say thanks. And if there are any other questions by the audience, I thank you all for being here. Laila Tov from Jerusalem. We'll see you on our next event.
Thank you very much.
The microphones are open.
Wonderful.
Amazing. Thank you so much. תודה רבה לך. ממש היה נהדר.
Thank you very much. I'm glad. Thank you for sharing. It's interesting always, these things often attract people who come to hear the tunes of their childhood. And there's been a book which is published with lots of Shir Ma'alot tunes. So for many people, it's something which is very close to heart, because it's like a family tradition of melodies. And so I'm glad to share it with you. Thank you for your patience, for your listening.
Thank you. I heard them from someone I know in Jerusalem. He's Jackie, and his wife is Gemini, and he used to sing all these tunes. He would say, no, even in the time, he would sing them.
Yes, for some people, it's very specific. You cannot sing any other tune for Sukkot. And it's very important to find the correct tune. But mangina nechona, as they say, it could only be in this tune. And so it's very important to find and locate which tune it has to be sung with.
He was like that. Amazing.
It's very, very, very Yekish. It's very typical German Jewish.
I just posted a fourth link in the chat room, which is to an article by Dr. Naomi Cohn-Zentner. Would you like to describe what you write in it?
Yes, this lecture is actually it was based on an article which published in 2019 in a journal called Hebrew Studies. And it's generally some of the main ideas and a few more elaborations of examples with notation of the various tunes. And again, describing this very important link in which the home is able to memorialize things that the liturgical traditions and synagogues which are destroyed can no longer be part of. And so the home is a stronghold. The home is an important place in which traditions can be continued, even though they're discontinued otherwise. So this is just many of the things which I mentioned today are put there in much better writing. They're established in a much better, clearly written English way, and not just in an oral way of doing it as we did in this session. So if you're interested, there's a link, you can download it, it's free. It's a PDF where you can just read it yourself. And again, a lot of credit to Dr. Gila Flam and all of the team in the music collection for allowing us to have these treasure, for it being accessible for researchers such as myself, and also for practitioners who want to see where these tunes are from and to find recordings of them. So thank you very much to the National Library.
Thank you all once more. Laila Tov.
Thank you very much.
All the best. Goodbye.